The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional shuffling of papers and the soft murmurs between attorneys. The judge adjusted his glasses, his sharp gaze moving between the two people standing before him. On one side, a man in a crisp suit sat with his lawyer, his expression unreadable. On the other, a woman clutched a folder in her hands, her face tense with determination. The tension in the air was thick, everyone in the room could feel it. This was supposed to be just another routine child support hearing. A simple matter of reviewing documents, calculating finances, and ensuring the child's well-being. But something about this case felt different. The judge had seen thousands of cases before, but something in the woman's eyes told him there was more to the story than what was written on the legal papers in front of him. The man's attorney was the first to speak. He stood confidently, his voice steady as he explained his client's stance. "Your Honor, my client has been more than fair. He has provided financial support, he has made every effort to be present in his child's life, and yet, the petitioner continues to demand more, claiming he has failed in his responsibilities. We believe this is an attempt to exploit the system." The woman's jaw tightened. She didn't interrupt, but her fingers curled tightly around the edges of the folder she was holding. Her lawyer gave her a reassuring glance before turning to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is not here for greed. She is here because the truth has been twisted. There are details that have been ignored, and we are prepared to present the facts that will prove that my client's claims are justified." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying both sides carefully. He had heard countless cases where parents fought over money, but he could sense something unusual beneath the surface of this one. He nodded for the woman's attorney to continue. The woman took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Your Honor, I have documents that show discrepancies in my ex-partner's claims. He has portrayed himself as a responsible parent, but the reality is very different." She opened the folder, pulling out several papers, and passed them to the court clerk. As the judge scanned the documents, his expression remained neutral, but his fingers drummed lightly against the desk, an old habit of his when something caught his attention. The man across the room shifted uncomfortably. His confident posture seemed to falter slightly, but he quickly masked it with a forced sigh, shaking his head as if dismissing whatever was being presented. "These are financial records, Your Honor," the woman's attorney continued. "Bank statements, employment records, and communication logs that contradict my client's ex-partner's claims about his contributions. Not only has he failed to provide consistent financial support, but there are also concerning patterns regarding his employment history." The judge raised an eyebrow, flipping through the pages. "These records indicate a substantial income that was not disclosed in previous filings. Mr. Reynolds, do you have an explanation for this?" The man's attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client has undergone financial struggles. Some of these earnings are from temporary work, and he did not think they were relevant to the case." The woman's attorney cut in, his voice firm but controlled. "Your Honor, these are not minor omissions. They show a pattern of deception. While claiming financial hardship, my client's ex-partner has been transferring funds into a separate account under a different name, avoiding his legal responsibility." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge's usual impassive expression shifted slightly. He looked directly at the man, his eyes sharp with scrutiny. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm going to give you an opportunity to clarify this. These are serious accusations." The man shifted again, this time visibly uncomfortable. He hesitated before answering. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. Those transactions have nothing to do with avoiding child support." "Then what are they?" the judge asked, his tone firm. The man's attorney quickly leaned over and whispered something to his client, but the woman was already reaching for another document. This one was different. It wasn't just about money. It was something that would turn the case upside down. "Your Honor," the woman said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about financial support. It's about my child's safety. There's something you need to see. She handed the document to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. As he read, his expression darkened. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The man's face strained of color. His lawyer's confidence wavered. The judge exhaled slowly, setting the paper down with deliberate care. He looked up, his eyes locking onto the man's. This, the judge said, his voice low but filled with authority, changes everything. The entire courtroom held its breath. The case had taken an unexpected turn, and no one knew what was coming next. Here's the continuation of your story. The courtroom remained eerily silent as the judge set the document down, his fingers resting on its edge. The weight of his words lingered in the air, making the tension nearly unbearable. The woman watched him carefully, her hands clenched together in her lap, trying to steady herself. She had waited so long for this moment to finally have the truth come to light. But she also knew that the hardest part was just beginning. The man, sitting across the room, swallowed hard. His lawyer, who had moments ago been calm and composed, was now flipping through the papers with a furrowed brow. The whispers between them were hurried, urgent. The man leaned in, whispering something back, but his lawyer's only response was a barely noticeable shake of his head. Whatever had been revealed, it was something they hadn't prepared for. The judge let out a slow breath and adjusted his glasses. Mr. Reynolds, before I proceed any further, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. What has been presented here does not just impact financial obligations, it raises concerns far beyond that. Do you have anything to say for yourself? The man shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against his knee. He looked down, his jaw tightening, before forcing himself to meet the judge's gaze. Your Honor, I don't know what she's trying to prove here. I've done everything I could. I've followed the law. I've never tried to hurt anyone. His voice, though steady, lacked the conviction he'd spoken with earlier. The woman's attorney leaned forward, his voice clear. Your Honor, my client has remained silent for too long, hoping that fairness would prevail. But that hasn't happened. That's why she brought this evidence today, because the truth has been buried under deception, and it's time to uncover it. The judge turned back to the woman, his expression softer now. I need you to walk me through this. Tell me exactly what led to this moment. She exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. It started years ago, she said, her voice carrying the weight of memories she had tried to forget. When we separated, he promised to co-parent, to provide for our child. But things didn't go the way he said they would. Payments were inconsistent. Excuses piled up. Some months, he'd claim he was struggling, that he had no money, while at the same time, I'd hear about his vacations, his expensive purchases, his nights out. She paused, pressing her lips together, as if holding back emotions that threatened to spill over. The judge gave her a small nod, signaling her to continue. But I didn't come here just because of money, she added, her voice steady but firm. I came because I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Phone calls he wouldn't return. Meetings he would cancel at the last minute. Our child coming back from visits looking exhausted, withdrawn. When I asked, I got vague answers. And then, I found something that made me realize this was bigger than I had thought. She reached into the folder again and pulled out another document, handing it to the clerk. The judge took it, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each word he read. The man's lawyer cleared his throat. Your Honor, I must object to any allegations that have not been properly reviewed. These are claims, not facts. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. I will determine what is relevant here, he said sharply before turning back to the woman. Go on. She swallowed. At first, I thought maybe I was overthinking things. But I started digging. I checked records. I went through old messages, receipts, anything I could find. And what I found didn't just prove he was lying about money. It showed that there were things happening that I never would have imagined. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. She's just trying to make me look bad. The judge's gaze darkened. Mr. Reynolds, I suggest you choose your words carefully right now. For the first time, the man looked genuinely shaken. He was no longer in control of the situation. Whatever he had been hiding was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. The woman took another breath before continuing. For months, he made me believe he was barely getting by. Meanwhile, he was hiding assets, shifting money around, and living a completely different life than the one he claimed. But it's not just about that. It's about the choices he made while pretending to be a responsible parent. She hesitated for a brief moment, then said the words she had been holding back for too long. And it's about the people he involved. A ripple of whispers spread through the small audience in the courtroom. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench, signaling for silence. You need to be very clear about what you're saying right now. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for yet another document. I'm saying that there were people around my child that should have never been there. People he chose to bring into their life. And the proof is right here. The judge took the papers, his expression unreadable as he read through them. The tension in the room grew so thick it was almost suffocating. The man's lawyer was whispering urgently to him now, his face pale, but the man didn't respond. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The judge set the papers down, folded his hands, and looked at the man with an intensity that made the entire room feel colder. Mr. Reynolds, he said, his voice quieter now but no less firm, you have been given every opportunity to be honest with this court. But the evidence before me suggests a pattern of deception, and worse, a reckless disregard for the well-being of your child. The woman's breath hitched, hearing those words. She had fought for so long to be heard, to be believed. And now, finally, someone was paying attention. The judge looked between both parties, exhaling slowly. Before I make any decisions, I need to review this further. But I want to make one thing very clear: this case is no longer just about child support. The silence that followed was deafening. The woman held on to the edge of the table, her heart pounding. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel so heavy. The man didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply stared at the table in front of him, the reality of the situation settling over him like a weight he couldn't escape. The judge looked at the clock, then back at the attorneys. We will reconvene after a short recess. I need time to go over everything that has been presented here. And when we return, I expect full transparency from both sides. With that, he banged the gavel, signaling a pause in the proceedings. As the courtroom emptied, the woman remained seated for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had done what she came to do. But she knew this fight was far from over. And when court resumed, the truth, every last piece of it, would finally come out. The courtroom was buzzing with low murmurs as people filtered back in. The judge's recess had given everyone time to absorb what had just happened, but the tension was stronger than before. The woman sat back down at her table, gripping her hands together to stop them from shaking. She had expected resistance, but now that everything was laid out, she could feel how close she was to the truth finally coming. Turned back to the attorneys. I need further clarification on the extent of exposure and the potential impact on the child. We will be reviewing all additional evidence carefully before a ruling is made. The woman's attorney nodded. Understood, Your Honor. The man finally moved, slamming his hand on the table in frustration. This is insane. She's doing this to ruin me. The judge's voice snapped through the room like a whip. You will remain respectful in this courtroom, Mr. Reynolds. The man's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath unsteady. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, trying to calm him, but it was clear the pressure was finally getting to him. The woman just watched. She had spent so long feeling powerless, feeling like she was shouting into the void with no one listening. But now, as she saw the way the judge looked at the man, the way his attorney struggled to keep control, she knew that was no longer the case. But she also knew this wasn't over. There was still one more truth waiting to be revealed, one more piece that would change everything. And when it came out, there would be no going back. The courtroom air felt thick, heavy with unspoken words and tension that only seemed to grow with each passing moment. The judge's warning still lingered in the air, but the man was visibly struggling to keep himself composed. His lawyer whispered something urgently to him, but he barely reacted. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The woman sat still, her heart pounding. She had seen him lose his temper before, but never like this, not in public, not in a place where his words could be held against him. He was unraveling, and for the first time, she could see the fear behind his anger. The judge exhaled slowly and flipped through the documents again. Then, he turned his gaze toward the woman's attorney. You mentioned earlier that this case is about more than just financial neglect. There have been concerns raised about the child's well-being, and this court takes those concerns seriously. Is there anything else that we have yet to address? The woman's attorney hesitated for a moment, then reached into his folder and pulled out another sealed document. Yes, Your Honor. My client recently obtained additional information that could change the scope of this case entirely. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The man's lawyer stiffened. Your Honor, we were not made aware of any additional evidence before today. We object to the introduction of last-minute documents that we have not had time to review. The judge glanced at the sealed envelope, then back at the attorney. Is this material time-sensitive or relevant to the allegations at hand? The attorney nodded firmly. Yes, Your Honor. The information inside is directly related to Mr. Reynolds' financial activity, but it also sheds light on inconsistencies in his claims regarding his personal life. This goes beyond child support. This speaks to the credibility of his statements under oath. The man's face visibly paled. He shifted in his seat, suddenly restless, his fingers drumming against the table. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but he ignored him. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench, thinking for a long moment. Then he nodded. Proceed. The attorney carefully unsealed the envelope, pulling out a series of printed bank statements and legal documents. He walked toward the evidence table, placing them down carefully. Your Honor, these records show financial transactions that directly contradict Mr. Reynolds' sworn statements regarding his inability to meet child support obligations. But more importantly, there is a transfer, one that occurred under highly questionable circumstances. The woman's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the part she hadn't even been sure they would find proof of. The judge adjusted his glasses and picked up the document, scanning it. His frown deepened. Mr. Reynolds, these records indicate that a large sum of money was transferred to an individual just days before your last child support hearing. This individual is connected to one of the people previously mentioned in court, one of the individuals your child was exposed to. A hush fell over the courtroom. The woman watched closely, waiting for his reaction. The man's hands curled into fists, but he didn't respond. He was staring at the table, his breathing unsteady. His lawyer flipped through the papers frantically, then shook his head. Your Honor, this transaction is unrelated to the case. My client has personal and business dealings that are outside the scope of this courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Because according to these records, the recipient of this payment is someone whose financial dealings have been under investigation before. And given the timing, the amount, and the context of this case, I find it difficult to believe that this is a coincidence. The woman's attorney took a step forward. Your Honor, my client has reason to believe that this payment was an attempt to conceal certain financial assets. But beyond that, we need to ask, why was this money sent to someone who had direct access to the child? The man finally snapped. That has nothing to do with this. You're twisting everything. His voice was sharp, desperate, as he slammed his palm against the table. His lawyer tried to calm him, but it was clear he had lost control of his emotions. The judge's gaze hardened. Watch your tone, Mr. Reynolds. The man gritted his teeth, exhaling sharply, but his eyes were darting around, like he was searching for a way out of the situation. The woman felt her pulse racing. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about accountability, about uncovering something he had tried desperately to keep buried. The judge looked back at the papers. I will need time to review this information fully before making a ruling. But based on what I see here, there are serious concerns that must be addressed. He set the documents down with a heavy thud. I am ordering an immediate review of all financial transactions related to this case. Any inconsistencies will be investigated thoroughly. The woman could see the panic in the man's face now. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid. He had built his defense on half-truths, on playing the system, on making her seem unreasonable. But the walls were closing in. The judge turned to her attorney. In the meantime, I want to ensure the child's safety. If there is any risk posed by the individuals involved, temporary custody arrangements may need to be reassessed. Her breath caught. This was more than she had hoped for, more than she had dared to believe was possible. The man's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, my client has had consistent contact with his child. This is an overreach. The judge gave him a long, steady look. Then your client should have no trouble providing a full, verifiable account of where the child has been during visits. Until then, I am placing restrictions on unsupervised custody arrangements. The man's face turned red with anger, but this time, he didn't argue. He just clenched his jaw, staring straight ahead, as if he had already realized there was nothing he could do. The woman let out a shaky breath. She wasn't naive, she knew this wasn't over yet. But for the first time, the power was shifting. The truth was coming out, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of what was yet to be revealed. The silence in the courtroom felt suffocating. The judge's decision to place restrictions on custody had shifted everything. The man, who had walked in that morning with confidence, now sat frozen, his face pale, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape. His lawyer whispered something to him, but it was clear nothing could undo what had already been revealed. The woman exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. She had fought so hard for this moment, but she wasn't ready to breathe easy just yet. There was still something left unsaid, something hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The judge cleared his throat and straightened in his seat. Before we conclude today's hearing, I need one final clarification regarding the financial records we reviewed. He turned his sharp gaze toward the man. Mr. Reynolds, you testified under oath that you were unable to meet your child support obligations due to financial hardship. However, the evidence presented today shows substantial financial activity that contradicts that claim. The man shifted in his seat. I can explain. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. I would advise you to think very carefully before speaking. If you continue down this path, you could be facing perjury charges. The man's lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but the man's hands were shaking. His breath was uneven. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. The woman's attorney stood. Your Honor, we request a forensic audit of Mr. Reynolds' financial records to determine the full extent of his assets. It is clear that he has been dishonest with the court, and my client deserves full transparency. The judge nodded. Granted. This court will conduct an independent audit. He let the words settle before adding, and if it is found that Mr. Reynolds intentionally withheld assets, further legal action will be taken. A rush of whispers swept through the courtroom. The woman's pulse quickened. This was a proof that he had lied, proof that he had tried to manipulate the system. The man shot up from his seat, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a setup. She's doing this to punish me. The judge's gavel struck the bench. Enough. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. You have been given every opportunity to present your case, and the evidence speaks for itself. The man's lawyer grabbed his arm, pulling him down, forcing him to sit. But his face was a mask of barely contained fury. The judge turned back to the woman's attorney. Does your client have any further statements before I issue my ruling? The woman took a deep breath. She had waited so long for this moment, and yet something in her gut told her there was still more. She looked at her attorney, then back at the judge. Yes, Your Honor. There's one more thing. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the man, still fuming, went still. The woman turned and reached into her bag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she handed it to her lawyer, who carefully unfolded it and placed it on the evidence table. My client received this letter 2 days ago, the attorney said. It was left anonymously, but the contents are deeply relevant to this case. The judge picked up the letter, scanning it quickly. His brow furrowed. This is a sworn statement. His eyes flicked toward the woman. Who wrote this? The woman's voice was steady, but her fingers curled against the table. Someone who was afraid to come forward before. The judge read further, his expression darkening with each passing second. Then, slowly, he looked up at the man. Mr. Reynolds, do you recognize the name signed at the bottom of this letter? The man's face strained of color. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The judge's voice was cold. This statement was written by one of the individuals you associated with during your time with the child. In it, they admit to being paid to withhold information from this court. More importantly, they detail an arrangement in which he transferred funds to them in exchange for ensuring that certain facts remained hidden. A collective gasp swept through the room. The woman's hands tightened. She had suspected for so long, but now, seeing it in black and white, hearing the judge read it aloud, made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. The judge placed the letter down, his expression unreadable. Mr. Reynolds, this document suggests intentional obstruction of justice. That is a serious offense. The man finally snapped. This is fake. This is all lies. His voice was wild now, desperate, but there was no conviction in his words. The judge ignored him. He turned to the court officers. I am ordering an immediate investigation into this testimony. Mr. Reynolds, until further notice, all custody arrangements will be placed on hold. Additionally, this court will issue an injunction preventing you from making any further financial transactions until the audit is complete. The man's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is the judge held up a hand. I have heard enough. He looked back at the man. I suggest you cooperate fully, Mr. Reynolds, because from where I stand, things do not look favorable for you. The man sagged in his seat, all the fight draining out of him. His fingers curled around the edge of the table, but he said nothing. The woman let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over. Maybe not legally, not yet, but in every way that mattered, the truth had won. The judge exhaled and leaned back. This hearing is adjourned. Court officers will escort Mr. Reynolds for further questioning. The gavel struck the bench, and just like that, it was done. The woman sat still for a moment as people around her whispered and murmured, filing out of the courtroom. She felt her attorney place a reassuring hand on her arm, but she could barely process it. South the court officers approached the man. He turned toward her, his face twisted with something between anger and desperation. You think you won? His voice was low, barely a whisper. This isn't over. The woman met his gaze, steady and unafraid. Yes, it is. And for the first time in years, she knew it was the truth. The courtroom emptied slowly, voices hushed as people processed what had just happened. The woman remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her heart still racing despite the fact that it was over. It felt strange, like she was waiting for some final confirmation that this was real, that she wasn't still trapped in an endless battle, constantly looking over her shoulder, bracing for the next fight. Her attorney gathered the files on the table, glancing at her with something that almost looked like relief. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stood your ground, and the truth came out." She nodded but said nothing. It still didn't feel like victory, not yet. There was too much history, too many years of fear and exhaustion weighing on her. Even now, with the judge's ruling in her favor, she knew the process wasn't over. There would be follow-ups, legal reviews, the forensic audit. But at least now, the burden wasn't on her alone. The system had finally caught up with him. She glanced toward the other side of the room, where the man was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to his lawyer. His face was tight with anger, his hands moving in frustrated gestures. The court officers stood nearby, waiting to escort him out. He wasn't in handcuffs, not yet, but the weight of the consequences pressed down on him just the same. For so long, he had controlled the narrative, twisted it in his favor, made her look unreasonable, irresponsible, overly demanding. But today, for the first time, the truth had stood on its own, and he had no power left to twist it. She stood, smoothing out her blouse with shaking hands. As she turned to leave, she felt his eyes on her. His voice was low but sharp. "You think this changes anything?" She paused, exhaling slowly before turning to meet his gaze. "Yes," she said simply. "It does." His expression flickered just for a moment, but then the mask of arrogance slid back into place. He scoffed, shaking his head, but there was no real confidence behind it. She didn't wait for another word. She walked past him, out of the courtroom, out into the fresh air where, for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Outside, the sun had started to set, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks. The weight on her chest was still there, but it was different now. Lighter. Manageable. Her attorney walked beside her. "You should take some time to process everything. This wasn't just about child support, and we both know it." She nodded, knowing he was right. This had never just been about money. It had been about control, about power, about keeping her tied to him in any way he could. But that grip was slipping now. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. Her child would be home soon. That was the only thing that mattered now, making sure they felt safe, secure, untouched by the chaos of the courtroom. "Will he really face charges?" she asked after a moment. Her attorney sighed. "It depends on what the audit finds. But given everything that's come out today, he won't be walking away from this easily." She nodded again, processing his words. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that the rules didn't apply to him. That illusion had shattered today. She reached her car and hesitated for a moment, staring at her reflection in the window. She looked the same, but something in her posture had changed. She wasn't hunched forward, carrying invisible weight. She wasn't bracing for another battle. She was just standing. Existing. As she got in and started the engine, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from a close friend, someone who had been with her through every court date, every late-night worry, every setback. "You okay?" She stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Yeah. I think I am." She pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward home. The road ahead stretched open before her, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next.